Welcome everybody to another in our series of virtual field trips from Cooperstown, New York. Welcome to our program featured here at the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum. We're very glad you could join us. My name is Bruce Marcus and I work in the Education Department. Today, our topic is the topic of cultural diversity. Our program is called Diversity in the Dugout. We're going to examine a lot of different features around this theme. We're going to look at immigration, the history of immigration in this country, look at the factors behind immigration. Why is it people have come here over the years? Economic, political, social factors, wartime factors as well. We're going to learn about baseball's ethnic and racial diversity over time and how that has changed. We will also develop an informal timeline for baseball's history of integration. So those are some of the topics that we'll be featuring today. We do thank you for joining us. I know that we have folks from around the country and we have some folks from other countries. I know we've had some Canadian viewers in recent weeks for these programs. What you can see now, picture of the Hall of Fame and Museum right out on your screen there. That's a picture from out on Main Street. Museum currently closed. We do hope that'll change in the near future. Now, when we do our programs, we like to begin with a virtual tour of the Baseball Hall of Fame, give you kind of a quick overview of our exhibits, what we have here, and then we'll get into the content of our program. Someone is asking exactly when the program will end. We usually run these programs 50 minutes to an hour, so somewhere in that vicinity. But I always do leave room for questions via the chat room toward the end of the program. So we'll go till about 1:50 or 2 p.m. Eastern time in that vicinity. Let's give you a sense of where we are geographically. Here we have a map of the northeastern part of the United States. You can see Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and then the state that I'm in, that the Hall of Fame is in, and that of course is New York State. There's a reddish arrow pointing at the Hall of Fame's logo. That's where Cooperstown is. We are in what's called central or upstate New York, and as a frame of reference, we are about a 4-hour drive from New York City, also about 4 hours from Boston, Mass., and about 4 hours from Buffalo, New York. So we're right in the middle of New York State, sometimes referred to as Leatherstocking region or Leatherstocking country. Here's what Cooperstown looks like from up above. This is a beautiful aerial shot of the village on a summer day. That's our wonderful Lake Otsego, once written about by the great writer James Fenimore Cooper. Very rural here, as you can see. This is the country, rural in terms of rolling hills, lots of trees, natural grass. No skyscrapers, our tallest building, all of 5 stories. Now, we are a small village. We have only 1,800 people who live here year-round. But we typically do get very crowded during the summer months. This year, we're not exactly sure when our season is going to pick up. But normally our summer tourist season is kind of the end of May to the beginning of September. And we get huge crowds typically during that time frame. Here we see in the top half of our screen a photograph of historic Doubleday Field, which actually is celebrating its 100th anniversary this year. It's currently under renovation. When it's done, it will seat about 10,000 fans. That's been its capacity over time. And it's going to look beautiful. They're going to make some major changes, create some clubhouse space, create a viewing deck. Really looking forward to the reopening of Doubleday Field. The bottom half of your screen is a photograph from our annual induction ceremony. That's an event that we typically hold toward the end of July, usually the last weekend in July. A major event that draws tens of thousands of people from around the country and the world. This is the biggest crowd we ever had. This was back 2007. Cal Ripken Jr., Tony Gwynn, 2 very popular players, great players, both inducted into the Hall of Fame. And this overhead photograph, we think there's about 80,000 fans at the induction ceremony out at the Clark Sports Center. 80,000 fans. Just to put that in perspective, Our full-time population here year-round is only 1,800. So we had more than 40 times our normal population here in the village. Inside the Hall of Fame, the centerpiece is our plaque gallery. This is where we feature the 329 bronze plaques, and they honor each of our Hall of Fame members. And when I say Hall of Famers, I'm basically talking about the greatest players, greatest managers, umpires, executives, and pioneers in the history of the game. Here are 3 of our Hall of Famer plaques, and they all tie into our subject today of cultural diversity. On the left and on the right, you've got plaques for Hank Aaron and Willie Mays, respectively. Both players started their careers in segregated baseball. They actually played in the Negro Leagues for a little while, and then eventually signed by major league teams. Both went on to have standout careers, absolute immortals of the game. And then in the middle, we have Roberto Clemente from Puerto Rico, the first Latino to ever earn induction to the Hall of Fame. That was back in 1973. We'll be talking more about Clemente during today's program. If we head up to the second floor of the museum, we have this exhibit. It's called Taking the Field, Baseball Before 1900. This looks at the origins of baseball, how the game got started. We believe the game goes back to the 1790s. So it actually began here in America in the 18th century, but it was not until the 19th century that the game really started to take a toehold in American culture, started to become very popular. And during the 1800s, the game went through a tremendous evolution, many, many changes. We illustrate that here with this sketch. This is a drawing from 1866. Shows you what a baseball game looked like back then. Notice, as we look at the field, we look at the players, some of the differences between the game then and the game today. For example, the batter does not have a helmet. The catcher has no protective equipment. None of that had been invented. None of that was being used. The fielders do not have gloves. We would not start to see that until a few years later. Gloves really would not become popular until the 1880s. But in the mid-1860s, they're using bare hands. That's why they use 2 hands to make plays in the field. Now, this is a ballpark of sorts, but there really isn't a stadium. There are no stands, no bleachers, none of that. In fact, there's no barrier between the players and the fans themselves. The fans are just lined up along the perimeter. You imagine a deep drive to the outfield. One of the outfielders could actually run right into the fans. So it could be a little bit chaotic, but it was just really a big open field with the bases set apart. You might also notice a dirt path running between home plate and the pitcher's mound. We believe that's left over from cricket. We think at one time this probably would have been a cricket field. And in cricket, they have a dirt path between, they don't call them pitcher and batter. They have different terms, but there's essentially somebody who throws, and then there's somebody who hits. And that dirt path would be used for cricket. It was kind of left over in some of these early baseball fields. One of our most popular exhibits, Diamond Dreams, all about women in baseball. Girls and young women have been playing organized baseball since the 1860s. So they have a long history and connection to the game. We explore the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. We look at great teams like the Colorado Silver Bullets, a team that did very well back in the 1990s before, unfortunately, they lost their sponsor and lost their funding. But the stories of these pioneering women told in Diamond Dreams. Here's our Pride and Passion exhibit. It's an exhibit that is currently undergoing some changes. When our museum does reopen, it'll look a little bit different. And then in 2022, we're going to do a complete do-over on this, this exhibit, which first opened back in 1997. You might say, why 2 years from now? Why 2022? Well, that'll be 75 years after Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier. But right now, this is what the exhibit looks like. It examines the history of African Americans in the game, looks at the subject of Jim Crow segregation, the Negro Leagues, and then ultimately the breaking of the color barrier by Jackie Robinson. We also have an exhibit up on the second floor about Latino players in the game. Viva Baseball is what that exhibit is called. Baseball is extraordinarily popular in many of the Latino countries, Mexico, Cuba, Nicaragua, the Dominican, Panama, Venezuela, Colombia, another country. Some of these countries, baseball is their national pastime. In other countries, it might be, second behind soccer, but it's very, very popular throughout the Caribbean. And today in the major leagues, approximately 30% of the players come from Latin America, which is really an impressive number. When you walk into the Viva Baseball exhibit, I love this fact that you have the floor is actually a map. I have to be honest, when I was in school, geography was not my strongest subject. So I always like when I walk into this exhibit, especially with school groups, I always look at the floor to get a sense of where these Latin American countries are in relationship to each other. Here you can see the Dominican, Venezuela, Colombia, Cuba, Mexico, and Panama. So it's a great way to kind of orient yourself geographically on what the Caribbean looks like. Some artifacts that we have in this exhibit, we have several baseball cards of Roberto Clemente, Puerto Rican Hall of Famer. Here you see the last regular issue Topps card that was put out by the Topps company. It was actually put out posthumously. Clemente had died New Year's Eve 1972, but as a way of tribute, Topps decided to produce a card for the late Clemente early in '73, and this is it, action shot showing Clemente in a spring training game against the New York Mets. We also have in the Viva Baseball exhibit, you see it on the right, that is a copy of Clemente's first professional contract. He signed with the Santurce team, Santurce, Puerto Rico, his native Puerto Rico, and the contract is actually in Spanish. Not surprising, since most of the players on this Winter League team were Latino, spoke Spanish as their primary language. So that is a copy of Clemente's first professional contract. This before he would eventually debut with the Pittsburgh Pirates. So our program today, Diversity in the Dugout. We are going to look at immigration, reasons behind immigration, learn about the game's ethnic diversity, and develop a timeline for integration in baseball over the years. We like to begin this program by showing photographs of a very important place, Ellis Island. And I want to ask the students in particular, the younger viewers that we have out there, think for a moment, what is Ellis Island? Have you heard about it? Have you maybe studied it in school? What was its primary purpose from 1892 until 1954? This is a photograph of Ellis Island in the 1800s. And here we have a more recent photograph of what Ellis Island looks like. From 1892 until 1954, it was America's primary immigrant processing center. It's where many immigrants came. They would be processed. They would go through a series of tests. And then ultimately determination would be made as to whether they could become American citizens. Now, the Ellis Island Center, the processing center, closed in 1954, but in the 1970s, Ellis Island reopened as a museum, as a place where you can go to visit. You can examine immigration records. You can look at ship manifests, look at people that came over here on huge ships, especially from Europe. And to learn about some of those folks, what they went through in coming to this country, trying to become American citizens. Here's a historic photo. It's from 1908, and it shows some immigrants who have recently arrived in the United States. And I like to ask people to look at these people. Don't focus so much on their clothing, but just look at their faces, look at their expressions. Most of them not smiling. Most of them have a very serious look on their face. I guess you could interpret some of them have a bit of a worried look. And I like to ask students why that is. Well, think about it. These are people who were born in other countries, probably have spent their entire lives there. But they've made the decision to uproot themselves, come to a place that's foreign to them, a place they've never been before, seeking a better life here. But that comes with the risks, and they don't necessarily know what the future holds. Yeah, they have some idea of what America is like, but until they get here, they won't have any firsthand experience. I always equate it to the first day at a new school. I remember when I went to high school for the first time, and it was a school in the Bronx. It was in a pretty tough neighborhood, and I took the train to get there, and it was a totally new experience for me, and it was very frightening that first day. I didn't know any of the kids. I didn't know any of the students, didn't know the teachers, didn't know the principal, the dean. It was pretty frightening. And I can imagine similar feelings for these folks. Yes, they're seeking a better life here in the United States, but that comes with risk, that comes with uncertainty. They don't know exactly what the future holds. So a lot is said in this historic photograph from 1908. The journey for immigrants in the early part of the 20th century was not glamorous, not romantic by any stretch of the imagination. Here we see one of these large ships containing immigrants. We're not sure exactly where they're coming from in this particular photograph, but look how everybody is jammed together. Everybody is in very close quarters. So this was not very comfortable. And of course, today we have so much concern about the spread of the coronavirus. Well, think about people coming over here in the early part of the 20th century. There may have been people who were ill, and they're in very close contact with other people. So some of these folks did become sick. Some of them did not survive coming over on these ships. The ship is also open. There's not much of a covering. So the cold, the wind, the rain, not glamorous, not a romantic way of coming over here, not at all. Here's a close-up of some of these folks, very much huddled together with cloaks, blankets, trying to stay warm, trying to stay comfortable, but not easy to do. Very, very difficult process they're going through. When immigrants came here to the United States, well, they would have to meet certain standards and pass certain tests. In 1891, the United States Congress added health standards to the restrictions. So an immigrant coming here, starting in 1891, would have to essentially pass a physical examination, make sure they're healthy, they're well enough to come here, stay here. In 1917, a law was put in saying that immigrants must pass a literacy test. So there were physical standards, and there were also, in a way, educational standards, literacy standards that had to be met by immigrants coming to the United States. Assuming that A, the folks coming over survived on the ship, and B, they were able to meet the standards, the literacy, the health standards. Assuming they do all that, they become United States citizens, but there are still problems, still challenges. Discrimination, resentment from Americans born here. They perhaps express resentment toward people coming here from another country. Language barriers. Many of the European countries, you have a language, primary language spoken that is not English. Italian, French, German, just to name three. So language barriers are a real problem. Social problems and cultural expectations, you can kind of group those two together. You know, certain behaviors in other countries maybe not accepted here in America, and vice versa. The way that you act in public, the way that you're expected to behave in certain situations, different in America than in other countries. So that's always an adjustment. And while most immigrants ultimately are seeking a better way of life, better job, more money, eventually they'd like to live in a nice apartment or house, probably at the beginning, at the very least, they're going to face economic difficulties. Many of these immigrants coming over in the early part of the 20th century, they're not moving into high-level jobs right away. They're taking entry-level positions, hoping to work their way up the ladder and eventually improve their economic situation. But at the very least, it's going to be difficult economically at the beginning of their journey here. One of the ways that immigrants could adapt to American society, assimilate in American society, is by learning about the games, the sports, the pastimes that are popular to us. For immigrants who came to the city game of stickball was a good alternative for them. This is a famous photo from 1910 from New York City. We see some young kids playing stickball. Probably a fair assumption that some of these boys, and I think there are some girls there too, probably some of them were immigrants or the sons and daughters of immigrants. And this was a way not only to entertain yourself and have fun, but it was a way to adapt to American society by learning the games that Americans like to play. And in the cities, stickball was really popular. They didn't have open fields. They were playing in streets and alleyways. So they had to adjust the rules. They even had to adjust the equipment, using broomsticks instead of bats to play the game. So by learning about games that are popular here in the country, these immigrants are better able to assimilate, to mix into American culture. In the country, in the more rural areas, immigrants might learn how to play a game like this, town ball. Now, this is actually not a vintage photograph. This is a photograph of some current day gentlemen playing a recreated game of town ball, which was a 19th century game. But it was a game that was sort of like baseball, but adapted to the wide open spaces in the country. You didn't have fair and foul territory. The field was actually 360 degrees all the way around because you had so much space with which to work. So immigrants coming to America, settling into the rural regions of the country like this, could learn a game like town ball. One of the people that emigrated to the United States at a very young age, this man, Harry Wright, now a member of the Baseball Hall of Fame. He was all of 3 when his family decided to leave England and come to the US. Now, when Harry Wright settled in America, in New York City, he began playing cricket as a young boy. Cricket, actually a British sport at the time, still played in England to this day. And here we see some modern day cricket players. So back when Harry Wright came to the US back in the 1800s, cricket was a big time sport in England. And he found that there was a club in New York City called the St. George Cricket Club, where he could play the British game of cricket. And other folks, other immigrants from Great Britain, from the United Kingdom, could also play the game of cricket at St. George's. Here's the problem. In America, not a lot of venues to play cricket. Yeah, sure, there was the St. George Club, but there weren't a lot of other locations or clubs where cricket was offered, where cricket was played. Baseball, back in the 1800s, that's the big sport. That's the developing sport. That's the popular sport here in America. So as a young boy, Harry Wright started to adjust, started to adapt. And he transitioned from playing cricket to playing baseball, and he was really good at it. In addition to that, he was also a very smart guy. Not only was Harry Wright a star outfielder, but he was very organized, a very bright guy, and he became kind of the manager and leader of one of the first all-professional teams. This is a team called the Cincinnati Red Stockings. And they became one of the country's first all-professional teams in 1869. When we say all-professional, that means all the players are being paid. So Wright organized this team. This team was really good. Their first season, they traveled the country. They didn't lose a single game. They typically would win games by lopsided scores of like 35-2. They were really good. They didn't actually lose their first game until their second season. Over the long haul, they had some financial problems. They disbanded after a couple of years. But by then, Harry Wright had established a reputation as a great player and as a manager and as a leader, and would eventually become a member of our Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. So Harry Wright, an immigrant from England, becoming a star baseball player, an iconic baseball figure here in America. So as the Red Stockings and these other professional teams started, and they became more and more popular in the 1870s, well, eventually these players, they would start signing contracts with their teams, formal agreements. Here we have a contract. Now think about some of the immigrants who came to the United States in the 1870s and 1880s. Think about some of these young men that came from other countries where English is not the primary language. So they're presented a contract in English. Well, maybe they don't read English. Maybe they speak it probably, but maybe they're not really good at reading it because it's new to them. Well, that's probably what the contract looked like to them, the way that this contract looks to me. Now, this contract is written in Russian. I do not speak or read a word of Russian. I have no idea what this contract says. But the players back in the 1870s and 80s and 90s, if they wanted to play and get money, they had to sign the contract. So they were kind of pressured to do so. So a lot of these immigrant players, because they didn't know the language, couldn't read English, they kind of felt pressured to sign a contract without knowing exactly what was in it. And in many of these contracts, not a lot of rights given to the players. So yeah, they were taken advantage of. And that was a real difficulty for those immigrants who came here that could not read English. They were forced to sign contracts that really, in a lot of cases, were not that favorable for them. Now, here we have a list of countries that have produced professional and major league players. And I want to ask you to do something. You don't have to do this on paper. This is something you can kind of do in your head for the next few seconds. Put these countries in order of when players made their major league debut. We have Mexico, Sweden, the Dominican, Japan, Germany, England, Puerto Rico. Of these 7 countries, which do you think is the first one that produced a major league player? Now, when I do this with school groups, a lot of times the kids will raise their hand and they might guess Mexico, because geographically, that's the closest country to the United States. And that's actually a good guess. But it turns out we did not have Mexican players until a little bit later on in the major leagues. In trying to answer this question, which of these countries was the first to produce a major leaguer? Perhaps think of the country that their culture is most similar to the United States. When you frame it that way, then your answer is probably going to be England. So of these 7 countries, England was actually the first one to produce a major league player. Let's look at this timeline of these players from other countries when they made their major league debuts. As I said, the first country to produce a player to play in the majors, Al Nichols, played for the old New York Mutuals, 1876. Then we had the first German player, 1884, Charles Pretzels Getzian. 1885, the first Swedish player. Now look at the dates, 1876, 1884, 1885. So we're encompassing 2 decades, 1870s and 1880s. This is reflective of the European wave of immigration that we saw coming into America at the time. There were a lot of immigrants who came to America during this time period from Europe. England, Germany, Sweden are all European nations, European countries. So it only makes sense that this kind of immigration is reflected in baseball. We see Europeans coming over and putting themselves into American culture in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. Well, it only makes sense that that would be reflected in baseball. So we have English, German, Swedish players come over. Now we're going to jump ahead to 1933. That's when the first Mexican comes in, and that's Mel Almada. Then in 1942, we have the first Puerto Rican player, Hidambi Thorne, a pitcher for the Chicago Cubs. And then in 1956, the first Dominican player, Ozzie Virgil, for the New York Giants. So look, 33, 42, 56, Mexico, Puerto Rico, the Dominican. What do those three countries have in common? They're all part of Latin America, Spanish-speaking countries. So here we see this Latin American wave of immigration coming to the US in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and it's reflected in what we see coming into baseball as well. Now, at the very end, you see one Japanese player, Masanori Murakami. We're going to talk more about him a bit later on. Some of the reasons why immigrants come here. They leave their native land because they don't feel they have a lot of rights. They feel oppressed by a tyrannical government. They feel like there aren't good job opportunities. There's no chance for that upward mobility. These are some of the factors as to why immigrants want to come here today, have wanted to come here for many, many years. Another factor, war. Here we have the Spanish-American War of 1898, so right at the turn of the century. One of the places badly affected by the Spanish-American War was Cuba. Cuba was war-torn. And some of the wealthier Cubans who had connections to the United States, they were able to use those connections to leave war-torn Cuba during this Spanish-American War and come to the United States. One of the families that did that was the Marsans family, and they had a young son, came with them, Armando Marsans. So they settle in New York City. Armando Marsans starts playing baseball at the famed Central Park, the huge public park in the middle of New York City. And that's where he essentially learns how to play the game and practices the game. And eventually Marsans will make the major leagues, become a star outfielder with the Cincinnati Reds. Now he was not the first Cuban player to play in the major leagues. There had been others that came before him, but he was really the first Cuban player to have a big impact, to have a really extended and successful career in Major League Baseball, Armando Marsans. And again, it all stemmed from the factor of war. So wartime factors, economic factors, political factors, having to live under an oppressive, tyrannical regime. These are all factors motivating people to come to the United States over the years. We still see an impact of Cuban players today. Here are a couple. Yoenis Cespedes, although he's been battling injuries with the New York Mets, and Jose Abreu, who has been a star for the Chicago White Sox. It's interesting when you look at Cuba, for many years, players could not come here from Cuba because of the policies of their longtime dictator, Fidel Castro. The relations between Castro and the United States were also very poor. So for a long period of time, we didn't see any Cuban players coming to America. That eventually did start to change. Some of these players became Cuban exiles. They fled the country because they wanted to get away from the Castro regime. They wanted the opportunity to play baseball in the best leagues, the American and National League, where they could make a lot more money as well. Now, Castro has since passed away. There has also been some improvements in terms of the relationship between America and Cuba, the two governments. That especially occurred under the Obama administration. Some people thought that that was going to lead to a wave of Cuban players coming into the major leagues. We really haven't seen that. You see players here and there. Again, we have Cespedes and Abreu on the screen, but we have yet to see a huge impact coming from that. We'll have to monitor the situation to see if that might change, to see if more Cuban players might come to the U.S. in the near future. Up until now, we've been talking about baseball's cultural diversity coming to us through immigration, people that have relocated from other countries. Well, how about from within the country? One of those ways was the Negro Leagues. Started in 1920 by Rube Foster, owner of the Chicago American Giants. He started the Negro National League, 8 teams located in the Midwest. Negro Leagues baseball became a huge industry. Now, why did Negro Leagues baseball have to exist to begin with? Well, it was kind of forced on them because black players, African American players, were banned from playing in the major leagues from 1887 on. It was a gentleman's agreement, a secret agreement that was reached basically by all the major league and minor league team owners. They stopped signing black players. So as you move into the early part of the 20th century, if you're an African American player of some talent and you want to play the game professionally, well, starting in 1920, your best option was to play in the Negro Leagues. It was really the first successful organized effort where black players and teams of black players could compete against each other in a high quality league. And some of the great players that emerged from the Negro Leagues, shown here on the left is Cool Papa Bell, great center fielder. He could run around the bases in 12 seconds flat, probably the fastest man in Negro Leagues history. Josh Gibson, probably the greatest catcher in the Negro Leagues. We don't know exactly how many home runs he hit several hundred. Negro Leagues records are a little bit sketchy, but he was considered the greatest home run hitter in the Negro Leagues. He was nicknamed the Black Babe Ruth. Some who saw him play said he was just as good as the Babe. But unfortunately, Bell and Gibson never got the opportunity to play in the major leagues. By the time Major League Baseball integrated in 1947 after the color barrier, Bell was retired. He was not playing anymore. And sadly, Gibson passed away. Gibson died of a brain tumor at a very young age in January of 1947. 3 months later, Jackie Robinson makes his debut for the Brooklyn Dodgers, but sadly, that was too late for Gibson and for other players as well. Now, Satchel Paige, who we see on the right, he did get a chance. He was a great pitcher, probably the hardest thrower in the Negro Leagues, at least during the first half of his career, probably threw close to 100 miles an hour. He was also a great showman, highly entertaining. Whoever he played for, that team tended to draw very good crowds. They tended to sell out the ballpark. Paige did get a chance to play in the majors toward the end of his career. He was 42, though, when he started playing in Cleveland for the Indians in 1948. Now, 42 in general sense is not old, but for a baseball player, it is pretty old. Baseball players, usually in their prime or in their 20s. Satchel had to wait until he was 42 before he finally had the opportunity to play. Why did Satchel get a chance to play? Why did other African-American players get a chance to play in the late 40s, into the 50s, 60s, and beyond? Well, Jackie Robinson. He broke that color barrier for the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1947. Yesterday, we celebrated Jackie Robinson Day. Robinson was a Negro Leagues player. He played shortstop for the Kansas City Monarchs. He was under enormous pressure to succeed. He knew that if he failed, that would delay the arrival for other black players in the major leagues. He faced bigotry, hatred, racism, insults, even death threats. Even some of his own teammates initially were against him because of the color of his skin. Somehow he overcame all of that, remarkably. Became an all-star, hit .311 lifetime, helped the Dodgers win the World Series 1955, won the National League MVP award 1949. A phenomenal career, one of the greatest second basemen in the history of baseball. He was successful. And because of what he did open the door for all these other African-American players who would slowly but surely start to get a chance to play. Here are 3 of those African-American players. Like Robinson, started professionally in the Negro Leagues. Hank Aaron played for a team called the Indianapolis Clowns. Ernie Banks played for the Kansas City Monarchs. Willie Mays was with the Birmingham Black Barons. Now, their Negro Leagues careers were relatively brief. Once they kind of proved themselves, major league teams were interested in signing them because they knew what kind of talent they had. Aaron would sign with the Milwaukee Braves, Banks with the Chicago Cubs, Willie Mays with the New York and then later San Francisco Giants. All become stars, all become Hall of Famers. But if you think about it for a moment, if Jackie had failed, if he had not done well, maybe these careers for Aaron and Banks and Mays would have been delayed. I mean, I think eventually they were going to make it in the majors. Eventually they were going to get that chance. But it might have come a few years later. Might have been delayed significantly. Maybe they don't put up the statistics, the numbers that they put up. They're known as three of the greatest players of all time. But that chance might not have come early enough for them to have that kind of impact, if not for Jackie Robinson. Not only did Jackie Robinson benefit African-American players, but he also benefited Latino players who also happened to be dark-skinned. Because the color barrier from 1887 to 1947, not only did that exclude African Americans, it excluded Latinos who had dark skin, who looked black in their appearance. And they were kept out of the major leagues as well. So Robinson's success opened the door for them too. Here we have Minnie Minoso, who became a star with the Cleveland Indians and the Chicago White Sox. A dynamic player, fast, hit for a high average, very exciting, versatile. He could play third base, could play the outfield. Became an all-star, one of the most exciting players in the American League in the 1950s. He was the first dark-skinned Latino to have a chance to play in the major leagues. He had also played in the Negro Leagues. So foreign-born Latino players played in the Negro Leagues if their skin was deemed too dark for the major leagues, if you will. So Minoso got the chance because of Robinson too. And that's one of the parts of the Robinson story that's not talked enough about, is the fact that he did help the Latino player. By the 1960s, we see many Latino players, many dark-skinned Latino players, not only making it with major league teams, but becoming stars. You know, you could go to almost every National League team in the 1960s and find one or two really, really good Latino players, some of them all-stars, some of them future Hall of Famers. By the mid-1960s, by 1965, when the Sports Illustrated issue comes out, they're talking about a Latino conquest of the big leagues. That's Juan Marichal, Hall of Famer for the Giants, on the cover. What do they mean by Latino conquest? Well, not literally having a conquest of the big leagues, but they're staking their claim to the legacy of baseball, just like African-American players. More and more Latino players coming into the game in the 60s. The game is becoming fully integrated. Now, one of the star players that developed out of this was Roberto Clemente. Clemente, from Puerto Rico, a territory of the United States, but he, like Minoso, a dark-skinned Latino. 1955, Clemente is able to make his debut for the Pittsburgh Pirates. And he would go on to become arguably the most famous Latino player in the history of the game. I'm going to show you now a short video of Clemente, just to give you a sense of what he was all about, the kind of player and the kind of man that he was.
He was the great one, slashing line drives to all fields, galloping around the bases, and unleashing laser beam throws from right field for the Pirates for 18 seasons. Roberto Clemente did it all on the diamond and changed the future of the national pastime. Off the field, Clemente became a legend well before his tragic death at the age of 38. Born August 18, 1934 in Carolina, Puerto Rico, Roberto Clemente quickly established himself as one of Puerto Rico's best amateur athletes. Though he would grow to only 5'11", his limber body and huge hands translated into speed, power, and a throwing arm unlike many had ever seen. The Brooklyn Dodgers scouted Clemente and then signed him to a contract worth $15,000 early in 1954. then tried to hide him in their minor league system at Montreal, despite his status as a bonus baby. But following the 1954 season, the Pirates selected Clemente in the Rule 5 draft and brought him right to Pittsburgh. After learning his trade and battling injuries his first 5 seasons, Clemente put it all together in 1960 to help lead the Pirates to the World Series title, batting .314 with 16 home runs and 94 RBIs. Over the next 9 seasons to close out the 1960s, Clemente became one of the game's transcendent players, winning 4 batting titles, 9 of his eventual 12 Gold Glove awards in right field, and winning the 1966 NL Most Valuable Player award. He seemed to improve with age, averaging .346 at the plate from 1969 to 71, helping the Pirates win 2 National League East titles and the 1971 World Series, where Clemente batted .414 and took home MVP honors. He became just the 11th player to record 3,000 hits late in the 1972 season before his life ended in a plane crash on New Year's Eve of that year. Clemente boarded an airplane overloaded with relief supplies for earthquake-ravaged Nicaragua, personally heading to the disaster site to ensure the food and medicine were dispensed to those in need. A tireless supporter of charitable causes and a hero to millions, Clemente was elected to the Hall of Fame in 1973 when the mandatory 5-year waiting period was waived prior to a special election.
One of the most exciting players I've ever had the privilege of seeing. I only saw him toward the end of his career, but gave you a sense of what he could do. So exciting to watch. He also became a big part of history. He was part of this first all-minority lineup, September 1st, 1971. The Pirates had a 9-man lineup, all players who were either Latino or African American. You had 2 players from Panama, 1 Cuban, a Puerto Rican, Clemente, and 5 African Americans, including Hall of Famer Willie Stargell. Now that day, September 1st of 71, the Pirates won the game 10-7, but that's not really important. What's important is about a month later, basically this same Pirate team would win the World Series. They would defeat the heavily favored Baltimore Orioles 4-3. So here's a team that essentially showed what integration at its finest could do. By going out and getting the best African-American players, the best Latino players, the best white players, by getting them all, bringing them all together, you could put the best team out on the field. And that's ultimately what it's about in the major leagues, trying to win, trying to put the best team out there. Let's talk about some other groups of people. Here we have Louis Sockalexis, not as well known as some of the other pioneers we've talked about. What group did he represent? Well, he was a Penobscot Indian. Sockalexis played for the Cleveland Spiders in the late 1800s, had a very good rookie season with the Cleveland Spiders, but struggled after that, faced a lot of bigotry. Some fans would mock him by making war whoop noises. Even players on other teams would give him a hard time about his ancestry. And unfortunately, he did not, handle that criticism or that bigotry quite as well as somebody like Jackie Robinson. Jackie was able to overcome it. Sockalexis, maybe a more sensitive guy, and he struggled. He struggled with alcoholism, and his career faded off relatively quickly, and he ended up dying young. He had a lot of physical problems. He actually passed away from tuberculosis. So it was very difficult for him. He faced a lot of the same bigotry that Jackie Robinson would face years later. But in the case of Sockalexis, sadly, he was not as successful as Jackie. Even so, other Native Americans have played. Jim Thorpe from the Sac and Fox Nation, often called the greatest athlete in the early 20th century, played football, played or participated in track and field, also played baseball for the New York Giants. Baseball was not his best sport, but he could play it along with the other sports, an incredible all-around athlete. Chief Bender, great right-hand pitcher from the Chippewa tribe, now a member of the Baseball Hall of Fame. And if you'll notice this name of Chief, a lot of Native American players throughout the 20th century, really up through the 1960s, if you were a Native American and you came to the major leagues, almost every time you'd be called Chief. You'd be given that nickname. This was an example of stereotyping. Basically, people would look at Native Americans and try to categorize them all in one way. Now, anybody who studied Native American history knows that not all Native Americans are chiefs. Not all Native Americans, wear headdresses or don war paint. Native Americans are different from tribe to tribe within tribes, very different. But this effort to sort of broadly categorize them in the same way, often kind of in an insulting, offensive way, this happened with a lot of the Native American players by calling all of them Chief. Thankfully, it's not done anymore. They don't use that Chief nickname, but up until about 1970, almost every Native American major leaguer was saddled with that nickname, and it wasn't fair, it wasn't right. Let's talk a little bit about Masanori Murakami. He would become the first Japanese player to play in the major leagues. If you go back in the history of Japan, Horace Wilson, a Civil War veteran from the States, taught at what is now Tokyo University, taught his students how to play baseball, brought baseball to Japan. And this was about 100 years before Masanori Murakami would come to the major leagues. He signed with the San Francisco Giants, pitched out of their bullpen for 2 years and did very, very well. But after his second season, became a little bit homesick. He also felt an obligation to his original team, the Nankai Hawks in the Japanese leagues. He wanted to return to Japan, and he did. But this created a dispute between Major League Baseball and Japanese baseball. The two organizations had hard feelings. So for the next 30 years, no other Japanese players could come to the US to play. Finally, in the mid-1990s, the major leagues in Japan settled their disagreements. Hideo Nomo finally debuts for the Los Angeles Dodgers, 1995. And 25 years later, we continue to see Japanese players have an impact. None more so than the great Ichiro, won an MVP award, Rookie of the Year, batting champion, one of the greatest pure hitters in the history of baseball. Just retired last year, not yet eligible for the Hall of Fame. Some people think, though, he might become the first Japanese-born member of our Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. There we see Ichiro preparing during one of his at-bats with the Seattle Mariners. We look at the game of baseball today. It is certainly more culturally diverse than it's ever been, certainly much more culturally diverse than it was in the early days of the game back in the 19th century. The game today is a melting pot of cultures. One of the things that's helped the situation is the World Baseball Classic played in 2006, 9, 13, and 17. Each of those years, the WBC has brought together 16 teams from worldwide countries to play in kind of a round-robin tournament. And this has sort of enhanced baseball's reputation as more of an international game and not so much just an American game. If you look at today's Major League rosters, about 30% of the players are from outside of the United States, roughly 25% of the players from Latin America. So we do see that huge influence from other countries. Just go back to 2018, you had players from 25 different countries playing across the 30 Major League teams. Now, does this mean everything is the way it should be? No, there are still problems that remain. One of the biggest problems that baseball has been facing for a number of years now, the lack of African-American players on Major League rosters. At the start of last season, 2019, only 7.8% of the players were African-American. Go back to the mid-1980s, about 35, 40 years ago. At the high point, you had 18% participation by African Americans in the game. So it's fallen from 18 to 7.8% during that time. And it's remained steady, around 8% or less for a number of years now. It's a problem that Major League Baseball has tried to address through a program called RBI, Reviving Baseball of the Inner Cities, but thus far it's only produced mixed results in terms of generating more interest in the game in the African American community, and perhaps motivating some of the young Black athletes to choose baseball instead of basketball, football, and some of the other sports. So this one of the current problems that baseball still faces in trying to continue to promote cultural diversity. All right, we do have a few minutes left in which we can take your questions. The way that you can do that, there's a Zoom group chat. You can go in there and you can just type your question, and I'll be happy to try to answer it over the final few minutes that we have together. You can ask questions about the theme of cultural diversity that we've explored today, questions about our museum, questions about the Hall of Fame, the election process that we have here. So we'll take your questions. Again, go to your Zoom group chat, type the question, hit enter, and it'll come my way. We had one person ask or mention they're reading a book called Shades of Glory about the Negro Leagues. That's actually a book that was written by historian Larry Hogan in conjunction with the Hall of Fame. It's a really good reference book for the history of the Negro Leagues. If you want to find out information about the Negro Leagues, which essentially ran from 1920 till the early 1960s, Larry Hogan's book is a really good source to do that. I believe the book is still in print. I know we have several copies at the Hall of Fame. So we will take your questions in the chat function over the next couple of minutes. We have a question from Sharon who wants to know, can you tell us something about Canadians in the major leagues? Well, certainly, Canadians have had a long connection to the game. Baseball is not as popular in Canada as it is here in the States. Canada's first game or first sport is hockey. So baseball is not as popular as hockey north of the border, but it is significant. Usually do see several Canadian players play each season. In fact, if you look at our Hall of Fame election this past January, Larry Walker, native of Canada, elected to the Hall of Fame, joining Ferguson Jenkins, also a Canadian Hall of Famer. For many years, Canada had a major league franchise, the Montreal Expos, beginning in 1969, before they did run into financial problems and then relocated to Washington in the early 2000s. But there's no question that baseball has popularity in Canada, not so much in terms of a league, but they do have minor league franchises. And Ottawa has a team. I know some other cities have a team. Of course, Toronto is currently the major league team that's represented in Canada. Toronto, an expansion franchise in 1977. So for a while, we did have two teams, Montreal and Toronto, but now just the one team, Toronto, represented in the major leagues. Question from Aaron. Have there ever been any players from Egypt? Yes. I know of at least one player. He was a shortstop for the Pirates back in the 1980s, Sami Khalifa. Didn't have a long career, but did play briefly for the Pirates in the middle of the 1980s. There may have been other players too, but Khalifa is the one name that comes to mind. And it is fascinating. You know, you look at players, we have representation of Hall of Famers from England, from the Netherlands with Bert Blyleven. Of course, we have a growing number of Latino players now in the Hall of Fame. Clemente was the first in 1973. But since then, a number of other Latinos, Luis Aparicio, Juan Marichal. More recent years, Vladimir Guerrero, Edgar Martinez, Roberto Alomar, Ivan Pudge Rodriguez. So we see more and more Latino players entering Major League Baseball. Question from JP Lazaro. Are there any players from Russia in the game? Not aware of anybody today. Nobody is coming to mind. I'll tell you what, though, if you want to send me an email at JP after the program, and I can reference it a little bit better for you to see if any Russian players have ever played in the majors. But currently, don't know of any that are there. And I'm going to send, if I can, I'm going to send, well, I'll just tell JP what my email is. So JP, if we have a pen, it's BMARKUSEN. Again, that's BMARKUSEN, as in Nancy, at baseballhall.org. So that's bmarkison at baseballhall.org. Send me an email, and I'll get you a more definitive answer about Russian players. Also, Brian wanted to know about the Nationals World Series exhibit opening. That actually did open up, I want to say, I think it was December. So that exhibit was up and running up until the time our museum closed about a month ago. And whenever our museum is reopened, that World Series exhibit honoring the Nationals and their championship of last year will still be there. Brian also wants to know any players from Israel. I know there have been a number of Jewish players. In terms of players born in Israel who played in the major leagues, not sure about that. So Brian, I'm going to ask you to send me an email as well. Again, that's bmarkison at baseballhall.org. And I'll try to look that up for you. In recent years, Israel has actually had a baseball league. Some of their managers have actually been former major leaguers, Jewish players, Ron Bloomberg, Ken Holtzman, two of the players that come to mind. All right, I think that's it for questions. Thanks for joining us on the chat. Thanks for joining us for our virtual field trip. Cultural diversity, diversity in the dugout. We do hope that you've enjoyed the program. And again, a reminder, please join us tomorrow, 11 a.m. Eastern Time. We'll have our first virtual Voices of the Game program with Kurt Smith, noted baseball writer, expert on broadcasting, also a presidential historian. And Kurt is going to join us for a virtual Voices of the Game, 11 a.m. Eastern Time tomorrow. So we hope you can be back with us for that. We do thank you for being with us today. We hope you enjoyed the program. Have a great day, everybody.